What if I told you Star Wars was on the cusp of a reset, just not in the way you might think? It's been nearly 2 years since The Mandalorian last graced our screens, a season which, for many, felt like the end of an era with the fallen Moff Gideon. But in reality, that was only the beginning. With new reports surrounding the premiere of the upcoming Mandalorian Grogu movie flooding the internet, fan reactions have been mixed to say the least. But here's the thing, there's way more going on beneath the surface than we realise. While the leaks suggest a soft reboot is in play, it's actually setting Din and Grogu up for something much bigger.
Mandalorian apprentice.
This is the way.
So once again, it's time to strap into your M1 starfighters as we unravel just what on Navarro is going on.
I'll be more selective in my assignments.
Before we dive in, don't forget to leave a thumbs up on the video and subscribe for more of our Star Wars coverage. Now with all that out of the way, let's get into The Mandalorian and Grogu.
Let me get this straight. You want to work for the New Republic?
On a case-by-case basis.
It's important to note, Star Wars has already changed massively since it was last in theatres. Back when The Rise of Skywalker first hit cinemas, there was only one Star Wars Disney Plus show in existence, The Mandalorian's first season. And even that hadn't finished airing at the time. Fast forward to now, we've had 3 seasons of The Mandalorian, Ahsoka, The Book of Boba Fett and various other shows spread across the timeline, alongside an ever-expanding story that's taken Star Wars in directions that casual fans might not even recognise. The Mandalorians have reclaimed Mandalore, Boba Fett's up on Jabba's throne ruling Tatooine, Project Necromancer is setting up Palpatine's eventual return in the sequels, and Grand Admiral Thrawn has emerged from exile. Oh, and they've also introduced an entirely new galaxy into the mix. Even Luke and Anakin have both returned in some form.
You look the same.
You look old.
So yeah, there's a lot going on, and that's kind of the issue. It's a lot for the average Star Wars fan who maybe only checks in on the movies to process. Most of these shows directly tie into the story of The Mandalorian, and of course they take place between the original trilogy and the sequels, meaning that if you haven't kept up, it's kind of hard to jump back in. And the reality is, most casual fans haven't been keeping up. The viewership numbers for Star Wars Disney Plus shows has actually been declining with the more they've released, so when all the reports and leaks surfaced, many of which are likely still to come as well, a lot of fans were expecting something huge, the kind that would justify Star Wars' long-awaited return to the big screen and put it firmly back on the map. But instead, from what we've heard so far, they aren't exactly the kind to take your breath away. However, there's a key part to this that a lot of people are missing. The casual fans, which are the most bums on seats, need an entry point, and that's exactly what the leaks are telling us the movie is providing. A soft reboot of sorts, for both the characters and the story to bridge the gap between streaming and cinema. Now, understandably, some fans are skeptical. There's a concern that focusing on these smaller, contained adventures means they're playing it safe, rather than pushing the story that's been built up over these past few years forward.
Approaching Dathomir, Grand Admiral.
But what if this setup is actually the key into launching Din and Grogu into something much bigger? And what if there's more to this reboot than meets the eye? After Din and Grogu played their part in defeating Moff Gideon at the end of Season 3, it almost felt like a final chapter closing. Sure, unless some of his clones made it out or he had some stored away in a hidden base off, well, then he technically could return, but that's a story for a different time. Coming out of it, the galaxy felt just a little bit brighter than when the show began. Din officially adopted Grogu as his son, and Grogu officially became a Mandalorian apprentice. Even if the season didn't live up to the hype created by the first 2, it felt like a satisfying conclusion, not just for the characters, but for the planet of Mandalore itself, and yet something about it felt like the end, even though Season 3 was never marketed as the final season. Looking back now, it was clear what they were doing. They were closing the book on this chapter of Din and Grogu's journey so that they can then start another one. Up until this point, Din's biggest enemy had been Gideon's faction, Imperial remnants working for Gideon rather than directly for the Empire itself, so naturally, it seemed like Din was being positioned to take on the next big threat, the wider Imperial remnants, which we all know would eventually be under Thrawn's control.
Heralding the re-emergence of our military.
We even saw him agree to work for the New Republic on a case-by-case basis, which made a lot of fans believe his next fight would be against Thrawn's forces. But if I told you back then that all of this would be put on the back burner in favour of a return to smaller-scale conflicts, much like what we had in Season 1, you probably would have called me crazy, and yet that's exactly what they're set to do. Now, I call this a soft reboot because they're not really erasing anything. Everything that happened still matters. But now, instead of continuing as they were on the small screens, Din and Grogu's journey is moving to theatres, and with that shift, they have to be mindful that many people watching this movie haven't kept up with the Disney Plus shows, and that's where the confusion and the concern starts to creep in. They're effectively stripping it back to basics, back to what made The Mandalorian so successful in the first place.
I can get you more credits.
I can bring you in warm.
So what exactly is this movie about? Does it mean we're not getting a conflict with the Imperial remnants? Well, no, not exactly, and we'll get onto that in a moment, but this is where it gets interesting. The latest reports say that Embo, a bounty hunter we first met in the Clone Wars, is set to be the main villain of the movie.
On piquer. Be séparés.
Now, I do believe that, but I also think this isn't the full story. There's much more to this, and we'll get onto that in a second, but first, bringing Embo into live action is one of those about-time moments. Through The Mandalorian and its connected shows like the Book of Boba Fett, they've introduced several characters who once only existed in animation: Ahsoka, Cad Bane, and Black Chrysanthemum. So now with Embo joining that list, it fits perfectly with what Lucasfilm have been doing over the past few years. For those of you who don't know, Embo is actually a pretty big deal. He's a bounty hunter who's been both an ally and an enemy to the Jedi, brushing shoulders with the likes of Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's worked for Palpatine, he's been hired by Sarge Ventress in the book Dark Disciple, and he was even tasked with rescuing Quinlan Vos from Count Dooku. But his history isn't just tied to the Clone Wars, there's even stories of him operating during the New Republic era, like when he tried to collect a bounty on Lando Calrissian shortly after the Battle of Endor. So yeah, this guy's history runs pretty deep, spanning multiple Star Wars eras. But one of the interesting things about Embo is, like many bounty hunters, he doesn't play by the traditional rules of good versus bad. He's worked for both sides at different points, not unlike Boba Fett. Once upon a time, Boba worked for the Empire, and now he's aligned with the good guys.
Till he has returned to you safely, we are in your debt.
And with Embo, it looks like he's set to go up against Din and Grogu simply because that's where the money is. And this is where things get interesting, because while Embo is being set up as the main villain, I don't think he's actually the real villain of this movie, but rather a stepping stone to something much bigger. So the real question really is, what actually is going on? And this is where another major report about the movie comes into play. Throughout his time as a bounty hunter, Embo has often found himself aligned with one group more than any other, the Hutts. And from what's been revealed so far, the story of the Mandalorian Grogu is said to be about Din and Grogu going up against Embo to save Rotta the Hutt. Now, if you remember back to the Clone Wars, this might sound familiar. Back then, Rotta was kidnapped as a baby and had to be rescued by Anakin and Ahsoka. But in this movie, things are completely different because Rotta isn't a helpless Huttlet anymore. Allegedly, Rotta's been kidnapped or marked for kidnapping, and it's up to Din and Grogu to save him. But this version of Rotta is said to be jacked with visible scarring on his face, and he even wields a vibroblade. So instead of the traditional Hutt crime lord, this version of Rotta is actually more like a gladiator, which is a huge departure from how we've seen the Hutts before. Like many of us immediately think of Jabba living the high life on his throne, devouring any poor little creature that gets served up to him, but Rotta is a completely different story. Now, according to reports, the Hutt twins we met in the Book of Boba Fett, the ones who gifted Boba the Rancor, are the ones who put the bounty out in the first place. The big question here is, why? Are they trying to remove a rival Hutt from power, or is there another reason they want Rotta out of the picture? And with Din and Grogu now working for the New Republic, there's a strong chance that this mission was assigned to them by Carson Teva. We're also hearing that Zeb from Rebels will be accompanying Mando on this mission too, at least for part of it. Now, I've heard some fans say they feel a little underwhelmed by the idea of this story, and I totally get that. It's not the big galactic scale conflicts we're used to with Star Wars movies. But I think that's because this mission isn't meant to be the grand finale. In fact, it's likely just the beginning. You see, we already know that regardless of whatever happens in this movie, Embo survives. He goes on to retire on a farm. So there's not really a huge personal stake for this villain at all, and that's why I suspect the whole Mando versus Embo to save Rotta storyline is actually just a setup. From what we've heard so far, this movie feels very much like Season 1, introducing the casual audience to the characters while setting up something much bigger. They're effectively using this story to bring the audiences up to speed, reintroduce Din and Grogu for those who aren't familiar, and place them in a position for the real war that's coming, and that's where things really start to take shape. Although this movie is actually pressing the reset button on The Mandalorian to a degree, that actually works in its favour as it's making it more accessible for the wider audience. Originally this was meant to be The Mandalorian Season 4, but it was restructured into a movie, and from everything we've seen in the connected Disney Plus shows, we already know where this is ultimately heading, a war between the New Republic and the Imperial remnants.
How real is the threat of Thrawn's return?
Throughout The Mandalorian, it always felt like a larger war was brewing, but at the time, much of the conflict was focused on Moff Gideon's faction. However, Season 3 gave us our first real look behind the curtain when we met the Shadow Council. It was here we learnt the Imperial remnants weren't as lost and as scattered as they initially appear. In reality, it was all just a front to keep the New Republic off their backs. They've been waiting for one thing, the return of Grand Admiral Thrawn to unite their forces and reclaim the galaxy. Now in Ahsoka, we saw the beginnings of that start to take shape. We saw him return, accompanied by the Great Mothers, while Ahsoka, Sabine and Huyang remained trapped on Peridea. So now Thrawn's next move will likely be about consolidating power, getting all of the Imperial pieces into position as he prepares to launch an attack. And that's exactly where I think the Mandalorian Grogu movie will eventually take us. So could the whole story of Embo and Rotta be part of Thrawn's bigger plan? Well, it's possible. as it could all be part of a larger scheme involving the Hutt twins. Maybe even a part of an attempt to reclaim Tatooine, which of course is currently controlled by Din's friend Boba Fett. But I think the more likely answer is much more simpler than that, with it likely being just a way to get Din and Grogu exactly where they need to be. Either way, this movie seems like it's doing one very specific thing, placing Din and Grogu directly in the path of Thrawn's Imperial remnants, and from there, it's only a matter of time before the war comes to them. And I think this will likely pave the way for the next Star Wars movie in this timeline to pick up from. Whether that's a second Mandalorian and Grogu movie, or the Dave Filoni crossover film, which is shaping up to be a live-action retelling of Heir to the Empire, one way or the other, everything seems to be pointing towards that war, and this movie is just the beginning. So really, I think taking The Mandalorian back to its roots as it transitions from the small to the big screen isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially if they resolve the whole Ember and Rota situation early on, bringing everyone up to speed before steering the story towards the larger Imperial remnant conflicts. Besides, we've seen how these smaller scale Star Wars stories can resonate just as much, sometimes even more, because they focus heavily on characters rather than just the scale of the conflict itself. It worked with The Mandalorian Season 1, and we've seen it work more recently with Skeleton Crew, so there's no reason why this approach won't work here too. So do you think Embo really is the main villain, or is there something much bigger at play? As always, drop your thoughts, theories and wilder speculations down in the comments below. Don't forget to leave a thumbs up if you've enjoyed the video and subscribe for more. I'll catch you in the next one, and may the Force be with you.